What do you have to know if you're going to be good at math? Well, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. In chess, if you're going to be good at endgames, you have to know king and pawn endgames. Now, in any endgame, the main goal is to safely promote a pawn and stop your opponent from doing the same thing. You want to be able to promote before they do. Now, today I've gotten all dressed up because it's promotion day for white's pawns in our drills we're looking at today. And we're going to start out by looking at an endgame by perhaps the greatest endgame player of all time, Jose Raul Capablanca. Capablanca was a natural talent at the endgame, but we can learn from his endgames and understand that it's all about getting the pawn safely to the other side of the board. In this endgame that Capablanca played in 1919, it looks like it's going to be a bit tough for him to break through. He's white, and he actually doesn't even have a passed pawn, but black does. Black's d-pawn is a passed pawn, but Capablanca changes that pretty quickly. He plays b4. It's not even guarded by anything, and yet there's no good answer for black. No matter how they capture, Capablanca will have a passed pawn. His opponent took with the a-pawn, and Capablanca starts to push. And the black king is ready to go after him. But now, Capablanca goes to create a passed pawn on the king side, on the opposite side of the board. And after a couple of captures, he's set to use the buddy system, the 2 pawns against the 1 pawn, so that he can push and create the passed pawn over there. In the meantime, his king has to stop his opponent from being able to promote a pawn safely. And after a couple more moves, Capablanca is clearly going to promote, and black is not, and black resigned. Now, equally as important as being able to get a pawn safely to the other side is stopping your opponent from getting a pawn to the other side. So here, black wants to create a passed pawn with a5, and white can simply play b5. And remember, en passant capture, if this pawn moves up 2 squares, you can capture it as though it only moved 1. So your 1b pawn stops both of those queenside pawns. We usually have to use our king in these king and pawn endgames. And in this position, we can see that the white king can just go rushing in and has a head start and has gained ground or has outflanked the black king. He'll run in, be able to take the a-pawn and win the game. It's not always that easy. Usually we have to use a little tool we call opposition. In opposition, you may recall, we have to put our king straight across from our opponent's king with 1 square in between. This will force your opponent's king to step to one side or the other, and then you can gain ground and allow you to outflank your opponent's king, get into their territory. Now let's have a look at some key examples. In our first opposition example, this is a very basic one. Our king moves in straight across from our opponent's king, and the black king has to choose which side to go to. When he goes one way, our king goes up and to the other. We'll be able to capture that pawn and win the game. Here it's a race, and you just have to calculate it out to realize that white easily wins the race. Now in this next example, it's black who has gained the opposition, but white has a reserved tempo, a saved up move. And you can just simply push that h-pawn 1 little square, and now it's black's turn. Black will have to give way, and the white king invades. Now be careful, because you have to play it defensively as well. Here it's black who's trying to win the game, and white's trying to hold the draw. Black has the opposition, and if we step our king to the side, the black king invades. If we go to the other side, he comes in this way, and we're in big trouble. So we have to use our reserve tempi in order to gain the opposition back. But be careful. You can push this a-pawn 1 or 2. Which one should you do? If you move 2, you lose. Black plays a reserve tempo move himself, and now you're in trouble. You move your king one way or the other, and the black king invades. So the only way to draw this game is by pushing the a-pawn 1 square. Black replies, you push again, and now you can just keep their king away from the action. Let's move on to talking about creating the passed pawn with the buddy system. Here we can see that white can create a passed a-pawn, but the black king is going to catch it. And we know this because of an idea called the square of the pawn. In the square of the pawn, we can count whether or not our king is going to be able to catch our opponent's passed pawns, or vice versa. Their king is going to be able to catch ours. Here you can see that the black pawn, we count 3 squares down, 3 squares over. The white king can move into the square. In the meantime, the black king is tied down to white's protected H-pawn. He has to stay in that square. If he steps outside, the white pawn pushes to the other side. Back to our position, we can see that the white pawn has 3 squares until it promotes. We count the same amount of squares sideways and finish drawing the square of the pawn. And the black king is inside the square. But here's the problem for black. We can now create another passed pawn, and there's 2 squares for the king to stay in. There's the square on the queen side, and then we have the square over on the king side. And he can't stay in both of them, and so white will be able to win the game. In this example, if we push our pawn, we notice the black king is in the square. He'll come back and catch it. So first things first, let's block him off and keep doing that. Uh-oh, if you push the pawn now, you were too hasty. The king comes back. So be patient. Instead, play your king up to f6 and keep him out, and now the pawn just goes walking in. Our final key element of pawn endgames is using your passed pawn as bait. And usually the first passed pawn that you create is going to be a bait pawn. It's going to be a pawn that draws your opponent's king away to go after that pawn. And here's a key. Once you've created that passed pawn, if you see that your opponent's king is in the square, that he's going to catch it, and you can't block him off with your king or other pawns, don't move your passed pawn again. That's just wasted moves. He's going to catch it anyway, so instead concentrate on the other side of the board, either by using a buddy system or bringing your king in to invade their territory, like we see in the drawing here from a game that Emmanuel Lasker played. So here in our final example, we have this passed A pawn, but pushing it won't help it. Notice if we push it, if it's up 1 square or 2 squares, the black king still catches it in just 2 moves. So black has to use 2 moves anyway, and while he's going off to the A file, our king is going to invade the other side. Let's watch the action. Notice how long it took him to capture that pawn and then come back to the C file where he started. And we're, of course, gobbling pawns. And it was important that we didn't waste any moves with our A pawn, because now look at this. Just in the nick of time, our queen gets back to save the day. And when it's a queen against a pawn, it's a pretty easy victory. All right, that's it for pawn endgames. I'll check you later.